She used the title again, and this time, the king finally said, "Enough." That's right. Meghan Markle walked into a high-profile Harper's Bazaar interview, styled as Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, and within days, Buckingham Palace quietly shifted into crisis mode. A line had been crossed, not with pomp, not with tabloids, but with something far more dangerous: intent. That title, once a symbol of unity, now a wedge of controversy, had been weaponized one time too many. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But here's the twist: this wasn't just about a name. This was about identity, control, and legacy. And for King Charles III, this was about drawing a final line in the royal sand. Why now? Why this moment? Why, after years of letting the Sussexes do their thing from across the Atlantic, did the palace suddenly bare its teeth? And what did Meghan really hope to gain by using that title again? Knowing full well the eyes of the monarchy were watching, grab a drink, sit down, because what unfolded next wasn't just a royal reprimand. It was the beginning of a royal reckoning. Let's rewind for a moment. The Duchess of Sussex. It's a title soaked in history, tradition, and these days, controversy. Meghan Markle received the title upon her marriage to Prince Harry in 2018. It was meant to be a gift, a welcome into the royal family. But ever since their exit from senior royal duties in 2020, that title has become a point of contention, not just for the firm, but for the world. You see, most people assumed the title was symbolic. That after Megxit, Meghan and Harry would slowly phase out their royal styling. But they didn't. Instead, they leaned into it. Netflix documentaries, children's books, podcasts, product lines, public appearances. The Duchess of Sussex wasn't just a royal courtesy. It was a brand. And for the British monarchy, that was the ultimate betrayal. Because the title, unlike a stage name or celebrity brand, carries something sacred, the crown's implicit endorsement. When Meghan uses the title, it suggests that she still speaks from within the royal fold, that she still belongs. But here's the problem: she doesn't. Not according to palace insiders, not according to royal watchers, and now, not according to King Charles. So when Harper's Bazaar introduced her as Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, in an exclusive holiday season feature, set inside a New York filming location, complete with a formal house manager announcement, it sent royal blood pressure soaring. And not just inside the palace. Public relations strategist Renee Smith didn't mince her words. It's confusing. It's provocative in the wrong way. It puts her straight back beneath the royal shadow she always insists she wants to get away from. Ouch. But she wasn't wrong. Meghan's entire post-royal branding, with love, Meghan, archetypes, as ever, was supposedly about independence, about liberation from royal protocol. So why, again and again, does she circle back to the title? Why keep wearing a badge from an institution you left behind? Let me ask you, if someone divorced their job, quit their contract, slammed the door on their former employer, would it make sense for them to keep showing up in that uniform? That's exactly how critics saw this Harper's Bazaar moment. But Meghan? Meghan saw it differently. And that difference in perspective? It's what triggered everything that followed. Inside palace walls, the reaction was swift, but private. Charles didn't make a public statement. He didn't hold a press conference or dispatch a royal aide to the Daily Mail. He simply got to work. And what's even more fascinating, he'd already been preparing for this moment. According to multiple insider reports, Charles and his legal team had quietly been reviewing the implications of title use since early 2023. The problem? Stripping a title isn't as simple as hitting delete. It's layered in centuries of precedent, constitutional sensitivities, and legal gray areas. Yet in this moment, when Meghan chose to stand before the world, once again styled as Duchess of Sussex, Charles found his resolve. This wasn't about revenge. This was about clarity. To quote one royal source, "It's not personal, it's institutional." The monarchy cannot afford ambiguity, especially from someone who now profits from the illusion of royal connection. And that illusion? It was on full display. According to Harper's Bazaar journalist Caitlin Greenidge, the scene was almost theatrical. Meghan arrived at the New York location, and before she even entered the room, a house manager made the formal announcement. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. As if the Queen were arriving. But the Queen is dead. And the monarchy has changed. And King Charles? He isn't one to let the family brand be hijacked. Not anymore. Let's talk stakes. What does stripping the title mean? Legally, publicly, emotionally? That's the billion-dollar question. Because legally, Meghan and Harry were allowed to retain the Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles after stepping back. What they couldn't use was the HRH style, Her Royal Highness. But the royal family hoped. Naively, some say, that the Sussexes would exercise discretion, that they would drift quietly into civilian life, perhaps using their first names or the Sussexes in informal ways. Instead, Meghan doubled down, and every time she did, headlines followed. Now, whether that was calculated or accidental is still up for debate. But the effect was undeniable. It made the monarchy look inconsistent, weak, even foolish. How could they say she wasn't royal, while she continued to carry one of its most recognizable titles? It was the equivalent of resigning from your job, only to keep using the CEO's parking spot. But the why is more complex. For Meghan, the title isn't just a name. It's leverage. It's recognition. It's a reminder that, for a brief moment in history, she was more than a celebrity, she was royalty. And let's be honest, Meghan Markle, actress and lifestyle influencer, doesn't hit the same way as Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. It's prestige, it's power, it's perception, but it's also pain, because that title ties her to a family that, according to her, treated her cruelly. It's the same institution she accused of racism, indifference, and isolation. The same firm that cut her off, that silenced her, that allegedly caused her to suffer in silence. So why hold on? Why cling to the royal label of an institution she publicly torched? That contradiction, that paradox, is the very heart of the storm. And here's where things get even messier. King Charles has always positioned himself as a modern monarch, a bridge between tradition and evolution. But even he has limits. And Meghan's constant title usage pushed him past them. What's more, the public is split, but the tide is turning. In recent polls, over 60% of Brits said they support removing the Sussex titles entirely. That number climbs higher among older generations and staunch royalists. And Charles is listening, because for all his efforts to modernize, he knows the monarchy lives and dies by public trust, by consistency, by symbols. And Meghan's use of the title became a symbol of chaos, of ambiguity, of rebellion. So Charles acted. And his move? It wasn't loud. It wasn't splashy. But it was final. And what followed? Quiet letters, legal language, media silence was far more devastating than a headline. Because now, the question isn't whether Meghan should lose the title. It's whether she already has. What makes a title more powerful than a throne? It's not just the crown, not the coat of arms, not even the royal blood. Sometimes, it's the illusion of royalty that packs the biggest punch. And Meghan Markle knows that illusion better than anyone. Because long after the gold carriages rolled past, long after the balcony waves stopped, and long after she walked away from her royal duties, the title stayed. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. For words, that's all it takes to ignite a firestorm. Inside the palace, inside the press, and inside public opinion. But here's the twist no one wants to admit. Meghan didn't lose the title when she walked away from royal life. She kept it, and the palace let her. Why? Let's rewind. Back in January 2020, the world was rocked by the bombshell now immortalized as Megxit. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle announced they were stepping back from senior royal duties. What they didn't say was that they were stepping away from their titles. Sure, they agreed, after some very awkward discussions at Sandringham, that they wouldn't use HRH, Her Royal Highness, styling anymore. But the dukedom itself? That stayed intact. By technicality, Meghan Markle is still Duchess of Sussex. But technicalities don't sit well in the royal world, especially when those technicalities become commercial leverage. Because Meghan didn't just keep the title. She used it. Again, and again, and again. Let's break it down. The Netflix documentary, Harry and Meghan, featuring lower thirds throughout labeling her the Duchess of Sussex. The Archetypes podcast, marketed and hosted by Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. The children's book, authored not as Meghan Markle, but the Duchess of Sussex. Even her legal filings, brand negotiations, and charitable foundations, everything continued to roll out under the title. Some people saw it as consistency. Others saw it as provocation. But the real question is, what did the palace see? They saw branding. They saw conflict. They saw a public figure who left the institution, lit it on fire, and still walked around wearing its badge. Can you imagine quitting a job in flames? Then turning around and using the CEO title for a business deal? That's what royal aides likened it to, behind closed doors. And yet, for a while, no one stopped her. Why? Because the monarchy was walking on eggshells. Charles had just taken the throne after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. The world was grieving. The monarchy was fragile. And any move seen as aggressive against Meghan, especially after the Oprah interview, risked a backlash the crown wasn't ready to face. So they stayed silent. Even as Meghan leaned harder into the title, even as Archewell pumped out content with royal framing, even as critics screamed, if she's so independent, why does she need the title? And here's where things get juicy. Because Meghan didn't just keep the title for herself. She made it a symbol of how she wanted the world to see her. Graceful, glamorous, global, but also royal. Royal without the responsibility. Royal without the rigidity. Royal without the rules. And let's be honest, who wouldn't want that? But every time she used the title, the palace lost a little bit of control. And Charles? He noticed. Flash forward to the Harper's Bazaar moment. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't a footnote in a press release. This was theatrical. According to journalist Caitlin Greenidge, when Meghan arrived at the New York filming location, a house manager literally announced her presence as if royalty had just entered the building. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. No mention of her last name. No casual introduction. No Ms. Markle. Just 4 words. And in that moment, the illusion was complete. To the room, she wasn't a former working royal. She was a royal. For the press, for the brand partners, for the production crew, it was as if 2020 never happened. But it did. And for the palace, this wasn't just a misstep. It was a declaration. Because Meghan didn't just walk into that room. She walked right back into the institution she claimed to leave. Without permission, without position, without consequence, until now. Let's talk PR. Because behind the royal etiquette, the titles, the lineage, lies a brutal truth. The monarchy is a brand. And Meghan? She understood that better than anyone. When she married into the family, she instantly became one of the most Googled women in the world. Not because of her acting career, not because of her philanthropy, because of the title, the Duchess of Sussex. Elegant, global, mysterious, romantic. It sounds like a character from a period drama, but that character was now rewriting her own script. From California, with a Spotify deal, a Netflix empire, and a lifestyle brand built on aspirational authenticity. And at the center of it all, that title. So when Renee Smith, an expert in public relations, called it a bad idea, she wasn't just talking from a royal protocol angle. She was talking from the perspective of brand clarity. Smith said, "It's confusing. It's provocative in the wrong way. It puts her straight back beneath the royal shadow she always insists she wants to get away from." Think about that. Meghan has built her post-royal image on freedom, on being unshackled from the expectations of monarchy, on blazing her own path. But the minute she walks into a room as the Duchess of Sussex, that narrative collapses. Because you can't be liberated and still wear the crown. Not without raising questions. And the British public? Oh, they have questions. Tens of thousands of people have signed petitions calling for the removal of the Sussex titles. Tabloid headlines call it title abuse. Political commentators suggest the monarchy looks weak for allowing it to continue. And yet, it continued. Until now. So why does this title matter so much? Because it's not just a name. It's not even about Meghan anymore. It's about control. About who owns the narrative. For Meghan, the title is a symbol of her journey, her identity, her connection to history. For the palace, it's a symbol of trust. A badge given in good faith, now being used, many would argue, out of context. So when Meghan walked into that room in New York and let the announcement roll, she made a choice. She chose the title. And in doing so, she reignited a war. Back in London, royal advisors were already tense. The upcoming holidays meant public appearances, speeches, media coverage. The king's team wanted a clean slate. No scandals, no distractions. And then this. The Harper's Bazaar article dropped. The headline? Inside Meghan, Duchess of Sussex's holiday message of empowerment. And there it was. The title, front and center. Charles read it once, then again, then allegedly pushed the paper across the table and said only this. Enough. Because this wasn't about pettiness. It was about precedent. If Meghan could walk into any room, anywhere in the world, and claim that title, then who was really in charge? Who got to decide what royal meant? And that's when the decision was made. Quietly, calmly, but decisively. A line had been crossed. And this time, the monarchy would not look away. But here's the thing no one's talking about. Meghan was warned. Insiders say that after the Archetypes podcast rollout, Buckingham Palace had reached out, informally, urging caution in how the title was being used commercially. They weren't making demands. They were suggesting discretion. But discretion was never Meghan's strong suit. And why should it be? She saw herself as someone finally free. Free to speak. Free to create. Free to lead. And yes, free to use her name as she saw fit. But for Charles, freedom without responsibility wasn't freedom at all. It was chaos. And chaos has no place in the crown. So now we stand at a precipice. The Duchess of Sussex title, once seen as a celebration of modern royal love, is now a battleground. And King Charles? He's about to change the game. But what he does next won't just affect Meghan. It will set a precedent for every royal family member to come. It will reshape how the world sees the crown. And it might just destroy the last thread tying Meghan to her royal past. Because what happens next will shock even her. He set the paper down in silence. That's how it started. No outburst. No storming through the halls of Clarence House. Just a heavy pause, a subtle shift in posture, and a quiet sigh as King Charles finished reading the Harper's Bazaar article. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. There it was again. And not just in print, but performed. Introduced at a New York production set with theatrical weight, as if Buckingham Palace itself had endorsed the moment. But they hadn't. They weren't even informed. And for King Charles, that wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It was a violation of trust. Because make no mistake, behind palace walls, trust is the currency that matters most. And Meghan? She'd just spent the last of hers. Picture the scene inside the king's private study. Aides at attention. The air tense. The tea going cold. One advisor, flipping through the article again, hesitates before speaking. Your Majesty, it appears they used the full styling. Another adds, carefully. There's also a video teaser. Social media traction is high. The clip's been reposted thousands of times. Silence. Charles folds his hands. And then, how many times must we let this happen before we put an end to it? No one answers. Because the truth? Everyone in that room already knew. This moment, this calculated use of the royal title, complete with prearranged introductions and media fanfare, was not a one-off. It was a pattern, and patterns demand consequences. But what made this one different? It wasn't just the usage of the title. It was when and how it was used. Because the Harper's Bazaar appearance didn't just happen in a vacuum. It came during a delicate time for the monarchy. King Charles was preparing for his first holiday season as monarch, a season meant to stabilize the firm after a turbulent year. Camilla was organizing charity engagements. William and Kate were scheduled for a high-profile state visit to a Commonwealth ally. The last thing anyone needed? Another Sussex headline. And yet, there it was. In glossy print. Framed with elegance. Branded with a title the palace never meant to become a weapon. Camilla's reaction, according to a palace source, was sharper than Charles's. She rolled her eyes, the insider claimed, and said something along the lines of, well, she's not subtle, is she? But behind the sarcasm was genuine concern. Because Camilla has always understood the game of optics. She knows how quickly public sentiment can shift. She lived through it. Villain to consort, hated to tolerate it. So when she saw Meghan using the title, again, in such a bold setting, she saw more than provocation. She saw danger. The Queen consort warned Charles that this was a trap. One royal watcher noted that if they didn't act soon, the title would become meaningless. Worse, it would become a tool of influence they could no longer control. And that was unthinkable. Because in a monarchy ruled by symbolism, control of the narrative is everything. Lose that, and you lose the crown. What happened next was swift, but not public. No flashy announcement. No official comment. Instead, The machinery of monarchy began to grind in the shadows. Legal teams were summoned. Advisors held late-night meetings. Historical precedents were dug out from royal archives. Communications staff began drafting language, formal but firm. Behind the scenes, a Sussex title strategy was born. Because the palace knew they couldn't afford to make this emotional. It had to be procedural. It had to look fair. It had to feel inevitable. And most of all, it had to be final. But here's where it gets fascinating. This wasn't the first time Charles had considered this move. In fact, according to multiple palace sources, the decision to formally explore stripping Meghan of the Duchess of Sussex title had been floated as far back as the Oprah interview in 2021. But back then, the Queen was still alive, and she wasn't having it. Her Majesty reportedly believed that removing titles, especially those granted during marriage, would make the monarchy look petty, that it would escalate the feud, not resolve it. Charles agreed, for a while, but now he was king. And as monarch, he was no longer bound by the late Queen's caution. He could act, and that realization, that this decision was now fully his, is what made him pause again. Because even Charles, famously reserved, knew the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just a title change. This was a message. To Meghan, to Harry, to the world. The message? There are limits. Inside the palace press office, tension reached a boiling point. One aide was overheard saying, "We can't keep being made fools of." Another added, "This is about the dignity of the institution. It's not just about Meghan. It's about the line of succession, the legacy, the future." Emails were exchanged with Kensington Palace, William and Kate's team. Though not officially involved in the decision, the Prince and Princess of Wales were kept informed. And William? Let's just say his response was cold. "About time," he allegedly said. "Let's not drag this out. No emotion, no hesitation, just resolve." Because for William, the title drama had gone on too long. And every time Meghan used Duchess of Sussex, it drew Kate, the future queen, into an unwanted comparison. "She's sick of it," one insider said of Kate. "The headlines, the rivalry, the shadowboxing. Enough is enough." So while this decision may have come from Charles, the support from his heir was unmistakable, and that made it bulletproof. But not everyone agreed. Inside palace circles, some feared the backlash. What if Meghan spun it as revenge, as punishment, as proof of the monarchy's pettiness? What if she went public with everything? What if Harry finally snapped? Those concerns were real, but Charles had an answer. "We cannot govern by fear," he told one advisor. "We govern by principle." And the principle was this: titles belong to the crown, not the individual. When you leave the institution, you leave its benefits behind. That includes the styling. That includes the privilege. And yes, that includes the title. Still, nothing was announced immediately. Charles knew better than to fire off a hasty decree. Instead, he began assembling a quiet coalition of support. Trusted constitutional experts were brought in, royal historians, legal scholars. They combed through centuries of precedent, from the Duke of Windsor to the stripping of titles post-World War I. The conclusion? The king could, indeed, revoke a dukedom, but it would require letters patent, issued under the Great Seal of the realm. A serious move, a public move, and one that hadn't been made in decades. But there was another option, more discreet, less nuclear. The palace could simply stop recognizing the usage of the title. They could update royal communications, remove the styling from official channels, let the public perception shift naturally. Would Meghan still technically be Duchess of Sussex? Yes, but publicly, she'd be nothing of the sort. And that strategy? It had Charles's fingerprints all over it. As the legal wheels turned, Charles made one more move. He called Harry. It wasn't formal. It wasn't scripted. It was father to son. And according to a senior source, the message was clear. This can't continue. She cannot use the title as a brand. It dishonors the institution, and you know it. Harry, stunned, reportedly asked for time. But Charles didn't offer much. "This is not about punishment," he said. "It's about respect." And then he hung up. Back at Clarence's house, an envelope was sealed. Inside, a briefing memo, outlining options, timelines, risks, and legal language. At the bottom, King Charles's handwritten note. Proceed with recommendation 2. Quiet withdrawal of styling. Public consistency. Zero deviation. No signature. just the royal seal. And just like that, the plan was set in motion. But Meghan didn't know yet. She was still in New York, still smiling for the cameras, still leaning into the styling, still, perhaps, unaware that the floor beneath her had already shifted. Because what was coming next wasn't a press statement, wasn't a confrontation. It was a cold, calculated act of erasure, a royal shadow slowly pulling away. And when Meghan finally found out, the fallout would be immediate and brutal, because the palace had spoken. And this time, it would be impossible to ignore. Can a king just take your title away? That's the million-dollar question, one that's haunted Buckingham Palace, lit up tabloids, and torched social media threads for years. And now, in the wake of Meghan Markle's latest Duchess of Sussex display, the question isn't just theoretical. It's urgent, because King Charles isn't bluffing anymore. But here's the problem. Stripping a royal title isn't like revoking a gym membership. It's not a simple matter of sending a letter or pushing a button. It's a legal, historical, and constitutional minefield, a maze of traditions, gray areas, and political landmines that even the most seasoned palace advisors tread carefully around. And for Meghan Markle, this legal web might be the one thing standing between her and permanent title exile. Or maybe not. Let's unpack the legal nightmare behind it all. First, we need to clear up a massive misconception. Meghan is not Princess Meghan. She never was. Yes, she married a prince. But unlike fairy tales, that doesn't make her a princess in her own right. Upon marriage, Meghan became Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex, a noble title created by the Queen for Prince Harry and conferred upon his wife by extension. But here's the catch. The Duchess of Sussex title is what's called a courtesy title, granted as a function of marriage, not inheritance or personal achievement. It's tied to Harry's status, and in theory, as long as she remains married to him, she retains it. Sounds simple, right? It's not. Because in practice, titles in the UK exist in a murky legal realm. There's no one piece of modern legislation governing royal titles. Instead, they're a cocktail of tradition, letters patent, parliamentary acts, and crown prerogative. And that cocktail is about to be shaken. Let's go back to the start. In May 2018, Queen Elizabeth II issued letters patent officially granting Harry the title Duke of Sussex on the morning of his wedding. Meghan, by marrying him, became Duchess. The titles were expected to carry into their royal work, reflecting seniority within the firm. But when the Sussexes stepped down in 2020, they kept the dukedom. Why? Because removing it would have required either voluntary relinquishment, which they were never going to do, or revocation via Act of Parliament or letters patent, a move the Queen was deeply reluctant to make. After all, the last time a title was forcibly removed from a royal was nearly a century ago. You guessed it, the Duke of Windsor. And we all know how that turned out. So the palace compromised. Harry and Meghan agreed not to use HRH styling publicly, but they retained their Duke and Duchess titles. But the legal ambiguity remained. What if they kept using those titles in provocative, commercial, or misleading ways? What if they turned them into branding tools? What if, God forbid, they used them to challenge the monarchy from across the Atlantic? Well, now we have our answer. So what are King Charles's actual options? Here's where it gets technical and messy. There are three main routes. 1. The nuclear option, title revocation via Parliament. This is the scorched earth path. It would involve Parliament passing legislation to formally remove the dukedom. Essentially, a law that says Harry is no longer Duke of Sussex and Meghan is no longer Duchess. Has this happened before? Yes, but only in extreme cases. Most notably, the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, which allowed the Crown to strip titles from royals who supported Germany during World War I. It's how titles were stripped from several German sympathizing princes related to the British royal family. But applying that law to Meghan or Harry? Highly unlikely. It would require enormous political capital and would drag elected officials into royal drama they've long tried to avoid. Could Charles request new legislation? Yes, but it would open the monarchy up to political debate, Republican backlash, and potentially even a constitutional crisis. Bottom line, possible but high risk. 2. Letters patent, silent surgical removal. This is Charles's preferred method. He could issue new letters patent stating that, due to non-working status or reputational concerns, the Sussex titles will no longer be recognized in public usage. This wouldn't necessarily erase the dukedom itself. Harry might retain it privately, but Meghan would no longer be publicly styled as Duchess of Sussex. It's a surgical strike. Quiet, controlled, legally sound. It allows Charles to signal a break without drawing parliamentary fire. But even this route has complications. Would Meghan fight it? Could she sue? Technically, no. Titles in the UK belong to the sovereign. They are granted, modified, or revoked at the monarch's discretion. You don't own a title. You hold it at the pleasure of the crown. That's where Meghan may find herself legally cornered. She can protest. She can complain. But in the eyes of the law, the king has the final word. 3. The passive approach. Just stop using it. This is the strategy currently being quietly implemented. Instead of formally removing the title, the palace simply stops referencing it. They scrub it from official documents. They update the royal website to remove references to Duchess of Sussex from Meghan's bio. They inform institutions, charities, press, event organizers, not to use the styling in connection with official royal events. Think of it as a soft freeze. The title still exists, but only in theory. And over time, it fades. It becomes irrelevant. And Meghan? She's left holding a title no one else acknowledges. It's like flashing a VIP badge at a club after they've already taken your name off the list. So where does this leave Meghan? In a gray zone. She can still technically call herself the Duchess of Sussex, as long as she does so within UK guidelines and without misrepresenting herself as a working royal. But every time she uses it, she digs herself deeper into controversy. And Charles? He's watching. Every appearance. Every quote. Every email signature. Because the minute Meghan crosses into implied endorsement, royal affiliation, or monetized nobility, Charles pulls the next lever. And the next. And eventually, the whole thing collapses. But let's talk emotion for a moment. Because legalities are one thing, but this runs deeper than parchment and parliamentary procedure. This is personal. For Meghan, the title isn't just branding. It's identity. She fought hard to be accepted by the royal family. She endured media scrutiny, institutional coldness, and personal betrayal. And when she finally walked away, she did so with a small piece of that world still attached to her name. The Duchess of Sussex. It's validation. It's legacy. It's proof that she once belonged to the most elite institution in the world, and they couldn't erase her. Now imagine being told, that name no longer belongs to you. That the very thing the world still recognizes you by is gone. Stripped. Revoked. Vanished. That's not just a branding issue. That's a crisis of identity. And what about Harry? Here's where it gets complicated. Because if the dukedom is revoked, or even just neutralized, Harry remains prince by birth. He can't lose that. But Meghan? She's tethered to royal styling only through him. And if the crown severs that tether, she's no longer anything royal. No HRH. No duchess. No title. Just Meghan Markle. And for a woman who built a post-royal empire partly on the power of that styling, that's an earthquake. So what happens now? In short, the trap is set. Charles doesn't have to make a grand speech. He doesn't need to draw blood. All he has to do is wait. Because every time Meghan steps onto a set and the announcer says, Duchess of Sussex, every time a podcast intro includes the styling, every time a product launch winks at the royal connection, it adds weight, evidence, precedent. And when the palace finally pulls the trigger, it won't look impulsive. It'll look inevitable. But what no one's asking is this. What happens when Meghan pushes back? Because sources say she's already consulting legal advisors, already looking at brand implications, already crafting language for clarification, distortion, and even gendered erasure. Will she go public? Will she fight? Will she accuse the monarchy of silencing her again? That's the risk. But Charles has calculated it. Because at the end of the day, he knows one thing. A crown without control is just costume jewelry. And he won't let that happen. But what came next would push the palace to the edge and test Meghan's resolve in a way she never saw coming. What do you do when your name becomes a business? What happens when your title, the one gifted to you by marriage, steeped in centuries of tradition, becomes your logo, your selling point, your brand? For Meghan Markle, the answer was simple. You run with it. You run with it all the way to Hollywood. But what started as savvy personal branding is now unraveling into a full-blown royal crisis. Because in Meghan's world, the title Duchess of Sussex isn't just a nod to her wedding vows or a ceremonial courtesy. It's part of a commercial empire. And that empire? It's being built on land King Charles says she no longer owns. This is the story of how royalty met revenue, and how one woman's brand collided headfirst with the crown. Let's start here. Branding is survival. In the modern world, especially post-scandal, post-royal, and post-UK tabloid beatdown, you don't just exist. You package yourself. You pitch yourself. You perform. And Meghan knew this from the start. She understood something most royal insiders didn't. She knew that being a royal wasn't just about duty. It was about visibility. The cameras, the narrative, the impression of influence. And once she stepped back from senior royal life, Meghan did what any modern celebrity would do. She leveraged the one thing no one else could copy, her title. Not her acting history, not her humanitarian work, not even her marriage to Harry. No, the secret sauce, the golden ticket, was being introduced as the Duchess of Sussex. Because that title? That's the difference between a lifestyle influencer and a global figure. That's the difference between an LA mompreneur and a woman who once lived inside Windsor Castle. It's aspirational, it's royal, and it sells. Let's break down the numbers. When Meghan launched her Spotify podcast Archetypes, how was it marketed? Hosted by Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. Every press release, every teaser trailer, every SEO-optimized tagline. It wasn't Meghan Markle. It was the Duchess of Sussex, inviting listeners into an intimate space while wearing the most expensive, invisible crown on earth. And it worked. The podcast hit #1 in multiple countries. Brands lined up. PR circuits spun. The image of royalty, redefined, captivated millions. And it didn't stop there. Her children's book, The Bench, wasn't credited to Meghan Markle, author. It was credited to the Duchess of Sussex. Archewell Foundation events? Always framed around her Duchess identity. Even her recent lifestyle brand, As Ever, a soft launch of honey, jams, and home goods, quietly leaned into royal aesthetics. British fonts, heritage tones, subtle cues meant to evoke not California sunshine, but English countryside sophistication. Coincidence? Please. Everything was intentional. Every lavender label, every press photo, every voiceover. And right there, in the background of it all, a title she claimed to want distance from, but couldn't stop capitalizing on. And that's where the contradictions began. Because Meghan's public messaging has always danced on a tightrope. We step back to live a more private life. We reject the institution, but not the values. We don't want royal roles, but we want to use our royal titles. See the tension? The problem wasn't that Meghan used her title. The problem was that she used it while pretending not to. She insisted in interviews that the monarchy was stifling, toxic, racist. She claimed to be suffocating in tradition, longing for freedom. And yet, every major commercial venture still bore the Duchess seal of approval. Every appearance, every launch, every brand alignment leaned on the very structure she said she escaped. Was it hypocrisy? Was it strategic? Or was it simply survival? Maybe all three. But to the palace, it was something far worse. It was theft. Because here's how the firm sees it. The title Duchess of Sussex was granted in trust. It was never supposed to be a logo, never supposed to be monetized, never supposed to appear next to product endorsements or inspirational quotes on Instagram. It was a ceremonial title tied to a working role, a role Meghan abandoned. So from Charles's point of view, she's cashing checks on a job she quit. And that's a problem. Because while the monarchy might be outdated in many ways, it runs on one crucial modern principle: brand protection. The crown is an institution, but also a global symbol. And if anyone, even a former member, starts exploiting that symbol for personal gain, the crown reacts. Swiftly, quietly, but ruthlessly. Let's not pretend Meghan didn't know this. She understood branding better than most royals ever have. Before she became a duchess, she was running a blog, striking deals, and building a lifestyle identity. She studied how public perception worked. She knew how to craft a narrative, how to appeal to aspirational markets, how to walk the line between intimacy and exclusivity. She wasn't just a former actress. She was a brand architect. So when she decided to carry the Duchess title into her post-royal ventures, that was no accident. That was strategy, and it was working. Until now. Enter King Charles. While Meghan was building a commercial ecosystem around her title, Charles was inheriting something else. The damage. Every time Meghan used her title in a business setting, it raised questions. Is she still a royal? Is this product endorsed by the palace? Is the monarchy involved in this brand? The ambiguity hurt the firm. And Charles, who spent decades waiting to lead, wasn't about to let his reign begin in confusion. He wanted clarity. So when the Harper's Bazaar incident hit, when Meghan was publicly introduced as the Duchess of Sussex at a luxury New York filming location, Charles saw the tipping point. This wasn't just Meghan being introduced with polite formality. This was branding. This was performance. This was profit. And the crown was being dragged into it. Without consent. Behind closed doors, royal aides compiled a list. A breakdown of every instance Meghan had used the title in branding, press, or promotion over the last 3 years. And the results? Alarming. Over 80% of major public engagements, TV, podcast, books, speeches, involved the Duchess of Sussex styling. In some cases, event organizers were explicitly instructed to use it. In others, the styling appeared in marketing copy Meghan's team had final approval over. This wasn't passive. It was planned. And that changed everything. Because once you demonstrate intent, it's no longer a misunderstanding. It's exploitation. And the king? He doesn't tolerate that. Especially not from someone who has publicly criticized the institution that made her who she is. But here's the twist. Meghan needs the title now more than ever. Why? Because Hollywood is cooling. Spotify cut ties after just 1 season of Archetypes. Netflix is demanding higher performance metrics. Archewell's impact has been modest. Far from the cultural tsunami it once promised. And Meghan's lifestyle brand, as ever, is still unproven. Without the title, the sparkle dims. The allure fades. The edge disappears. She becomes, dare we say it, normal. And for someone who was catapulted into superstardom by the uniqueness of her royal role, that's not an option. So what now? This is where branding becomes a battlefield. Charles is tightening the noose. PR firms are being contacted. Media groups advised. Royal protocols clarified. Event organizers are being warned. Do not use the Duchess of Sussex styling in association with working royal events. And quietly, behind the scenes, websites are being updated. Entries rewritten. Search engines re-optimized. The palace is reclaiming the narrative. Bit by bit. Brick by brick. But Meghan? She's not backing down. Sources say she's doubling down on branding. More visual content. More polished production. More emphasis on her voice, her message, her products. And at the center of it all, still the Duchess. Still the styling. Still the title that started it all. But there's a storm coming. Because in this game of brand versus crown, someone has to blink first. And Meghan? She's not the type to flinch. But Charles? He's not bluffing anymore. And the next move he makes will send shockwaves through both their worlds. He was the boy who once said, "I'm just Harry." But now, he was caught between 2 worlds, 2 legacies, and 2 women who defined them. And for Prince Harry, this wasn't just about a title. This was about identity, about loyalty, about how far he'd go to protect the woman he loved, even if it meant burning the last bridge he had left to the institution that raised him. Because when King Charles began preparing to quietly strip Meghan of the Duchess of Sussex title, one thing became clear. Harry would have to choose. But choose what? His family? Or his freedom? His father? Or his future? And as tensions boiled over behind palace doors, one phone call, just one, would force Harry to confront the very thing he'd spent years running from. The royal machine. The one he thought he'd left behind. It started with silence. When the Harper's Bazaar news broke, Harry was in California, reportedly wrapping meetings on new documentary concepts. Meghan was busy coordinating her next product launch under her as ever brand. The headlines were loud, but the couple was quiet. Until a courier arrived. A letter. Stamped. Royal seal. Marked private and confidential. Harry read it alone, behind closed doors. Inside, a notice. Calm, deliberate, and devastating. The palace was initiating a process to review the public styling of Duchess of Sussex. Language was cautious, but the message was unmistakable. The title's days were numbered. And Harry? He knew exactly what that meant. His wife, his partner, his co-creator, the mother of his children, was about to be erased from royal history. At least, that's how he saw it. And it shattered him. Because for Harry, this wasn't about branding. It wasn't about optics. It wasn't even about protocol. It was personal. It was emotional. It was painful. You see, Harry had spent years protecting Meghan. From the media, from the institution, from the very machine that had once consumed his mother. When he saw the way Meghan cried after her first royal tour, when he heard how she was silenced, when he watched her being chewed up by the press, misquoted, vilified, he made a decision. He would never let what happened to Diana happen again. And now, the palace was coming for her name. The last royal link she had. The last piece of identity she hadn't surrendered. To Harry, this wasn't just a technical move. It was an attack, and it felt like betrayal. But here's where the internal conflict boiled over. Because while Harry was furious, part of him understood. Deep down, he knew the crown had rules. He knew his family had expectations. He knew what the titles meant, and what the consequences would be if they were misused. He wasn't naive. He'd been born into the system, schooled by it, bound to it, whether he liked it or not. And part of him always thought the Queen might have left the door open. A quiet return, a possible reconciliation. But now, Charles was closing that door, and Meghan was standing in the doorway. There were arguments. Insiders say Harry and Meghan clashed behind closed doors. Not about the title, necessarily, but about the timing. Why now? She reportedly asked. Because of the branding, Harry said. Because of the video. Because of how it looked. And you think I did that on purpose? She fired back. Silence. That silence said everything. Because Harry wasn't sure anymore. Was she trying to provoke the palace? Was it a strategic move? Or just another moment of misread formality? Harry didn't know. And that uncertainty? It terrified him. He picked up the phone. He called his father. The call was short, tense, painful. Harry asked one question. Are you really going to do this? Charles responded. I already am. Then added, this is not about Meghan. This is about the institution. But to Harry, that was the problem. Because for years, the institution had been an excuse. A wall, a shield, a way to avoid responsibility. And now, that wall was going to be used to erase his wife's identity. And he couldn't stop it. Not this time. But the real heartbreak? Harry wasn't sure he wanted to. He was tired. Tired of the headlines. Tired of the tension. Tired of defending Meghan against a family that refused to understand her. And defending the family to Meghan, who would never truly forgive them. He was stuck. Every time Meghan said, they never wanted me, he wanted to scream, that's not true. But every time his father sent another cold letter, or ignored Archie's birthday, or refused to correct a tabloid lie, he wondered if maybe it was. And now, with the title on the chopping block, he had to face the truth. Maybe he couldn't bridge the two worlds. Maybe he never could. In public, he stayed silent. But behind the scenes, Harry called his lawyers. He asked what legal ground Meghan had to keep the title. The answer was murky. Yes, the monarchy technically owns the styling. No, it's not trademarked in the way most brands are. Yes, they could challenge public usage. No, they couldn't necessarily block Meghan from using it privately. But Harry didn't want another lawsuit. He didn't want another PR war. He just wanted peace. And that peace was slipping further away by the hour. Friends say Harry became withdrawn, quiet, brooding. He skipped a scheduled call with Netflix producers, missed a follow-up with Spotify. He walked the garden at Montecito alone, declined Meghan's invite to join her for tea with business partners. He was haunted by one question. Did I start this? Because in a way, he had. He'd been the one to walk away from the firm. He'd been the one to demand space, freedom, autonomy. He'd stood on that stage in Vancouver years ago and declared there was no other option. And now? That option was costing him everything. His family, his past, and now his wife's identity, and maybe her trust. Then came the final blow. A source leaked to the press that the palace had already updated internal guidance. Effective immediately, we request that media and public organizations refrain from styling Meghan Markle as Duchess of Sussex in public-facing materials. No royal statement. No front-page announcement. Just a quiet erasure. A ghosting. And when Harry read it, he wept. For his wife. For his family. For the future he once believed they could all share. So what did he do? He wrote a letter. Not to Charles. To William. 3 paragraphs. Handwritten. Delivered by private courier. It read, in part, I know we're not where we should be, but I need you to understand. This isn't about rebellion. It's about love. And the woman I love is being humiliated. Again, you and I can fix this. Or we can let it break us forever. William never responded. At least, not yet. And Harry? He hasn't sent another. But here's the twist. While Harry was spiraling in silence, Meghan was making moves. She'd scheduled meetings. She'd pulled in PR advisors. She was drafting statements. She wasn't giving up the title without a fight. And Harry? He wasn't sure which side he was on anymore. Because for the first time in their marriage, the conflict wasn't them against the world. It was Harry in the middle, and the next choice he made would define everything. Because what came next was a private message from someone Harry never expected, someone who had everything to lose, and was about to change the rules again. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't a public declaration. It didn't come through aides or advisors or layers of protocol. It came through him, direct, measured, final. King Charles picked up the phone and called his son, not as a grieving father, not as a desperate grandfather, and not as the man who once wept when Harry was born. He called as king, and this time, there was no room for negotiation. Because after months of silence, awkward glances across rooms, and passive-aggressive headlines, Charles had decided. He wasn't going to ask anymore. He was going to tell. The call was placed from his private study at Clarence House. Not Windsor, not Sandringham, and definitely not from the grand rooms of Buckingham Palace. This wasn't about pomp. It was about power. Charles waited for Harry to pick up. He did. No greeting. No pleasantries. No small talk about the weather in Montecito or Lilibet's latest painting. Just one line. It's time to put the title to rest. Harry didn't respond right away. Because how do you respond to that? The title wasn't just a name, it was a statement. It was legacy. It was history written into law. And now, with a single sentence, Charles was ready to erase it. But the king wasn't calling to debate. He was calling to deliver an ultimatum. Let's rewind 24 hours. Reports were swirling. Meghan had just wrapped a shoot for an upcoming campaign. Organic teas and artisanal jams. The brand? As ever. Soft pastels. Serene gardens. A rustic chic aesthetic meant to whisper authenticity, but scream luxury lifestyle brand. But what caught royal advisors off guard? The label on the press packet. Curated by Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't smart. Because this came after the palace had already begun phasing out the styling internally. After the quiet advisories to media partners. After Charles's team had sent a clear message. Stop using the title. Stop profiting off the crown. Stop playing royal while refusing the role. And now, she was doing it again. This time, with a product line. This time, for profit. This time, for all to see. Charles saw red. According to a senior palace source, the king's reaction was unlike anything staff had seen before. He reportedly stood up mid-briefing, tossed the press packet across the table, and said, "She's daring me, and I won't blink." Those around him knew what that meant. The soft approach was over. The passive-aggressive PR strategy? Dead. The king was about to get personal. And the target? Not Meghan. Harry. That night, Charles sat alone in his study. Not with advisors. Not with Camilla. Alone. He scribbled notes. Practiced phrases. Because this wasn't just about stripping a title. It was about drawing a line. A final one. And when he finally made the call, he didn't stumble. He was cold. Precise. And absolutely done playing diplomat. You've had your time to step back. You've had your time to build your lives. But that title, her using it in public, for products, for press, is over. Do you understand? Harry was quiet. Then, you're doing this to punish her. Charles snapped. No, I'm doing this to protect the crown. To protect your future, whether you want it or not. Harry replied. You're taking away her identity. Charles countered. No. She walked away from the role. This is about respect. And if you won't set the boundary, I will. Then came the hardest line. If she uses the title again, I will issue new letters patent. I won't delay. And I won't reverse it. There it was. The nuclear threat. The formal removal. A move not seen since King George V stripped German-affiliated royals of their titles during World War I. But this wouldn't be about war. It would be about disgrace. And Harry knew it. The call ended abruptly. No resolution. No compromise. No I love you. No goodbye. Just a deadline. And in that silence, everything shifted. Because Charles had just weaponized the one thing Harry couldn't fight with podcasts or documentaries or tell-all memoirs. He weaponized history. And in royal life, history always wins. Within 48 hours, a draft memo was circulated among palace communications staff. Subject line. Title clarification language, Duchess of Sussex. It instructed staff to begin phasing out usage. Updating website entries. Preparing for a possible full statement. More interesting, legal language was being tested. Because while Charles was prepared to give Harry one last chance to voluntarily stop Meghan's usage of the title, he was also preparing for a scenario where he'd strip it unilaterally, which would involve public documents, media blowback, and perhaps the final, irrevocable collapse of the House of Sussex. But Meghan? She wasn't standing down. Reports suggest she viewed the call as a royal overstep. She believed the title was hers by marriage, and that public styling, especially in lifestyle settings, was a personal right, not a royal privilege. One insider quoted her saying, "If they didn't want me to use it, they shouldn't have given it to me." Another claimed she told staff, "I earned it, and I won't let them erase me from history just to clean up their narrative." To Meghan, this wasn't about the monarchy. It was about control. It was about not being silenced again. And this time, she had her own platform. But Harry was caught, stuck between a father drawing a sword and a wife refusing to retreat. And the pressure was suffocating. Sources close to him say he began questioning whether the title was worth it. He asked Meghan privately, "What if we just stopped using it?" Not for them. For us. She didn't answer. Because for Meghan, the title wasn't just a styling. It was a symbol of everything she'd endured, everything she'd survived, everything she'd overcome. She wasn't going to hand it back like a library book. But here's where the cracks deepened. Harry began calling close friends, people he trusted from his army days, from before royal fame. And he asked one question, "Do you think I've lost who I am?" And when one friend replied, "I think you're trying to live in two worlds that don't fit anymore," Harry hung up, because that was the truth he didn't want to face. The world of Prince Harry and just Harry were colliding, and only one would survive. Meanwhile, Charles was making calls of his own, not to family, to legal scholars, to historians, to archivists. He was drafting options. Should Meghan continue using the title in defiance of his request? Should Harry publicly support her? Should the Sussexes dare to push back? Charles would be ready, and his next move wouldn't be subtle. It would be historic. It would be unprecedented, and it would be permanent. But just as Charles finalized his plan, someone inside the firm leaked something unexpected. A message, a warning, from someone who hadn't spoken publicly in years. And when Meghan heard what was said, her entire strategy changed. Because what came next turned the title fight into an all-out war. He set the paper down in silence. That's how it started. No outburst. No storming through the halls of Clarence House. Just a heavy pause, a subtle shift in posture, and a quiet sigh as King Charles finished reading the Harper's Bazaar article. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. There it was again, and not just in print, but performed. Introduced at a New York production set with theatrical weight, as if Buckingham Palace itself had endorsed the moment. But they hadn't. They weren't even informed. And for King Charles, that wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It was a violation of trust. Because make no mistake, behind palace walls, trust is the currency that matters most. And Meghan? She'd just spent the last of hers. Picture the scene inside the king's private study. Aides at attention. The air tense. The tea going cold. One advisor, flipping through the article again, hesitates before speaking. "Your Majesty, it appears they used the full styling." Another adds, "Carefully. There's also a video teaser. Social media traction is high. The clip's been reposted thousands of times." Silence. Charles folds his hands. And then, how many times must we let this happen before we put an end to it? No one answers. Because the truth? Everyone in that room already knew. This moment, this calculated use of the royal title, complete with pre-arranged introductions and media fanfare, was not a one-off. It was a pattern, and patterns demand consequences. But what made this one different? It wasn't just the usage of the title. It was when and how it was used. Because the Harper's Bazaar appearance didn't just happen in a vacuum. It came during a delicate time for the monarchy. King Charles was preparing for his first holiday season as monarch, a season meant to stabilize the firm after a turbulent year. Camilla was organizing charity engagements. William and Kate were scheduled for a high-profile state visit to a Commonwealth ally. The last thing anyone needed? Another Sussex headline. And yet, there it was, in glossy print, framed with elegance, branded with a title the palace never meant to become a weapon. Camilla's reaction, according to a palace source, was sharper than Charles's.